Jennifer stood barefoot in the kitchen, holding a chipped coffee mug in both hands like it might ground her. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was dense. Her daughter was with her ex that weekend. The house, once full of noise and negotiation, now echoed with a kind of absence she couldn't name. She had finally left. After 17 years of making excuses for why he didn't mean it that way, she packed 2 suitcases, signed the papers, and walked out. Everyone called her brave, but tonight, alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the ache in her chest, she didn't feel brave. She felt like something hollowed out. She'd always believed that letting go meant weakness, that boundaries meant failure, that kindness meant staying. But what if all of that was wrong? What if leaving wasn't the end, but the beginning of something quieter, something truer? What if letting go wasn't giving up, but finally choosing herself? And still, the fear whispered, if I don't fight for this anymore, am I abandoning love, or just no longer abandoning myself? She didn't have the answer. But in that moment, she set the mug down, stepped outside into the cool air, and breathed. Maybe, just maybe, surrender wasn't a collapse. Maybe it was the first honest exhale after years of holding it all in. Jennifer didn't leave with rage. She left with a whisper. After 17 years of smoothing over tension, apologizing for things she didn't do, and trying to love someone who only saw her in fragments, she walked out of the home they built and into the unknown. There was no final fight, no dramatic storm of suitcases down the stairs, just a quiet Friday afternoon when her daughter was at school, and she realized she couldn't breathe in that house anymore. That kind of stillness, when the decision is already made and the only thing left is to follow through, is rarely recognized as courage. But that's what it was. At first, the emptiness felt clean, liberating, her own space, her own bed, her own voice unchallenged in the air. But freedom can be deceiving when you've forgotten who you are without someone else telling you. Jennifer found herself moving through her new apartment like a guest. She cleaned obsessively, arranged books she didn't read, organized a kitchen she rarely cooked in. All the external noise was gone, but inside her mind, new voices had taken over. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I should have tried harder. Maybe this is my fault. That's when she called Maya. Maya had been her colleague years ago, someone who knew what it was like to unravel and start over. She had survived her own fire, a long-term partner who drained her emotionally, a job loss that left her identity dangling by threads, and a panic disorder that once sent her to the ER because she thought she was dying. But now Maya spoke with a quiet strength, like someone who had stood at the edge of something vast and decided not to jump, but to sit there and breathe instead. They met for coffee, but Jennifer barely touched her drink. I just feel like I left the fight too early, she said. Like I was supposed to be stronger, more forgiving. Maya stirred her tea slowly. You didn't leave the fight. You just stopped letting it be a war against yourself. Jennifer's eyes welled, but she blinked it back. She had become so used to defending her pain that she didn't know how to simply be with it. Letting go, for her, had always meant defeat. Her father used to say, "You don't quit family." Her mother, more religious than spiritual, taught forgiveness like a one-way door. You walk through it and never look back, even if the house is on fire. But if I forgive him, Jennifer whispered, does that mean I have to let him back in? Maya smiled, but it wasn't the comforting kind. It was the kind of smile that came after surviving something real. Forgiveness doesn't mean access, she said. It just means you're done carrying the weight of his choices. That sentence shifted something. Jennifer didn't say anything, but her shoulders dropped a little, like she'd been holding up a world that was never hers to carry. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed, still unfamiliar, still too clean, and stared at the photo on her nightstand. Her daughter, 6 years old, missing a front tooth, beaming beside a birthday cake. In the background was her ex, arms crossed, eyes scanning something just out of frame. Jennifer remembered the moment vividly. She had baked that cake from scratch, stayed up until midnight decorating, and he had spent the entire party scrolling his phone and criticizing the frosting. She picked up the photo and asked the question out loud. Was that love, or just me working too hard to feel safe? There was no answer. But silence, for once, didn't feel empty. It felt like space. The next day, she began journaling. At first, it was awkward, but Maya had told her not to edit anything, just write whatever comes, so she did. Anger, shame, nostalgia, love, guilt, more shame. But eventually, through the tangled mess of emotions, a sentence arrived that didn't feel rehearsed. I can love someone and still not let them hurt me again. That was the turning point. It wasn't clean. Her ex kept texting, sometimes angry, sometimes sweet. He wanted to talk things through, to try again. Her family complicated things even more. Her sister accused her of making things harder than they need to be. Her mother cried and quoted scripture. Even her daughter asked once, "Why can't Daddy stay for dinner sometimes?" Jennifer didn't have perfect answers, but she was learning to say, "Because I need to take care of myself first," and let that be enough. For so long, Jennifer equated letting go with being cold, but she started to see it differently. Letting go wasn't about pushing people away. It was about choosing the version of herself that no longer had to earn peace through suffering. It was drawing a line, not in anger, but in devotion, to her own healing. She began practicing what Maya called compassionate boundaries. Not walls, not ultimatums, just a quiet set of choices made daily. If her ex texted, she didn't respond immediately. If he showed up without notice, she didn't let him in. She didn't explain or apologize. She simply stopped negotiating with guilt. It wasn't easy. Some nights were still heavy. Some mornings she woke up unsure. But beneath all that, something steady was forming. Not strength in the traditional sense, not the grit your teeth and push through kind, but a softness that refused to be erased. A clarity that whispered, "You don't have to break to prove you're whole." And one afternoon, while folding laundry and humming a song she couldn't remember the name of, her daughter walked in and said, "Mom, you seem different. Happier?" Jennifer looked up, surprised. "Really?" Her daughter nodded. "Like lighter. Like you're not tired all the time." Jennifer didn't know what to say, but in her chest, something loosened. Not everything was fixed. Not everything was clear. But she was no longer trying to drag the past into the present and make it behave. She was learning, day by day, how to live without the need to rescue what didn't want to be saved. She was letting go. And for the first time, it didn't feel like giving up. It felt like coming home. Jennifer thought things would get easier once she drew the line. But instead, the silence grew louder. Boundaries, it turned out, weren't just about telling others no. They were about learning to live with what happened after. Her ex began a subtle campaign, one that didn't shout but whispered. He told mutual friends she was unstable, too emotional to raise a child on her own. He left voice notes full of sighs and half-finished apologies, vague enough to stir guilt but not clear enough to warrant forgiveness. When Jennifer didn't respond, he sent flowers to their daughter's school and asked the teacher to pass along a message. The message wasn't for the child. It was for Jennifer. I still care. She wanted to scream, but she didn't. She just sat with it. The manipulation didn't look like cruelty. It looked like charm. That made it harder to explain, harder to defend against. But Maya had warned her. Emotional control isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the softest thing in the room. Jennifer started keeping a list, not of wrongs, but of moments. Simple, clear facts. The dinner where he criticized her for crying over her father's death. The afternoon he changed the bank password after an argument. The night she locked the bathroom door and just sat there while he yelled through it. Not to keep score, but to remind herself that the past didn't need to be rewritten just because she missed parts of it. Still, it was hard. Not just because of him, but because of everyone else. Her sister Sarah believed in reconciliation at all costs. She'd stayed in her own strained marriage for the sake of the kids and couldn't understand why Jennifer wouldn't do the same. "You don't just walk away when it's hard," Sarah said over the phone one night. "Marriage isn't supposed to be easy." Jennifer didn't argue. But later she thought, hard is fine, hurt is not. It was a small distinction, but it changed everything. Then came the weekend with her mother, a woman raised on obligation, devout, dutiful, always quoting scripture or old sayings like armor. Jennifer told her gently about the decision to create firmer boundaries, that her ex would no longer be stopping by unannounced. That co-parenting didn't mean codependency. Her mother clasped her hands and frowned. "But what about forgiveness?" Jennifer met her eyes, steady. "I'm forgiving him, but I'm also forgiving myself for thinking forgiveness meant staying silent." There was no response, just a long pause. Then her mother changed the subject, asking if she was eating enough. That was her way of backing down. Later, Jennifer wrote in her journal, "Forgiveness without boundaries is just martyrdom." Maya continued to be her quiet anchor. They didn't talk every day, but when they did, the conversations had weight. One evening, Maya told her about a practice she'd used during her own recovery from a controlling relationship. She called it the threshold meditation. "You sit still," Maya said, "and imagine a door. Behind it is the version of you that kept making herself smaller, who stayed silent to avoid the storm. You thank her. You don't shame her, because she kept you safe for a long time. But then gently, you step through the door, and you leave her there, not because she's bad, but because she's tired." Jennifer tried it that night. At first it felt silly. Then suddenly it didn't. She pictured herself at 29, negotiating every word in a text to keep peace. She saw her at 35, staying up late to rewrite birthday cards so they sounded less dramatic. She saw the version of her who apologized before she even knew what she was apologizing for. And she whispered, "Thank you, but I'm ready now." The next morning, something shifted. She didn't check her phone first thing. She didn't rehearse answers for imagined confrontations. Instead, she made coffee, played a jazz record Maya had recommended, and opened the window just enough to let the breeze in. Then, the call came. It was from the school. Her daughter had forgotten her science project. Jennifer's stomach tightened. This was the kind of thing her ex would use as ammunition. If she were with me, this wouldn't have happened. She thought about calling him, but paused. Instead, she drove to the school herself, dropped off the project with a smile, waved to her daughter, and left. Later that day, she did receive a text from him. "Another thing forgotten. Maybe it's too much for you." She didn't reply. Not out of pettiness, but because there was nothing to engage with. The silence this time wasn't avoidance. It was choice. Boundaries weren't walls. They were clarity. She started practicing something new, saying no without apology, declining invitations that didn't feel right, not explaining her decisions to people who hadn't earned that kind of access. It wasn't about revenge or closing off. It was about conserving energy, making peace a priority, not a performance. One Saturday afternoon, Jennifer and Maya went hiking. It wasn't a deep, symbolic moment, just two women walking, breathing in the scent of pine and old earth. Maya pointed to a broken branch dangling from a tree overhead. "That'll fall soon," she said. "The tree's already started letting it go." Jennifer stared at it. The branch still clung, even though the connection was brittle. She saw herself in it. "I used to think letting go was violent," she said, "like tearing something off." "And now?" Maya asked. "Now I think it's just stopping the effort to hold on." Maya smiled. They didn't say much after that. They didn't need to. By the end of the trail, Jennifer felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not triumph, not certainty, but rest. And that was enough. Jennifer didn't notice the shift at first. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. There was no epiphany in the mirror, no single moment of clarity. Instead, it arrived in fragments, in the way her voice no longer trembled when setting a boundary, in how she no longer drafted replies she never sent, in the way she could finally sit with silence without needing it to prove something. It was a rainy Tuesday when she realized she hadn't thought about her ex all day. Not out of bitterness, not from avoidance, but simply because he no longer lived at the center of her emotional orbit. It startled her. For months, even in his absence, he'd been everywhere, in her decisions, in her fears, in her guilt. And now, he wasn't. She found herself looking out the window, coffee cooling beside her, watching the raindrops streak the glass. And for once, she didn't feel the need to fix anything. Not the weather, not the past, not even herself. It had taken time to get here, not just time in days, but a time in presence. She had stopped trying to rush her recovery. There was no healing schedule, no emotional milestone to hit. Some days, she still cried when folding her daughter's laundry. Some nights, she lay awake wondering if she'd ever truly trust again. But those moments no longer derailed her. They became part of her rhythm. Not setbacks, just echoes of a story she no longer lived inside. The real transformation came when she stopped performing resilience. For months, she'd worn strength like armor. Friends praised her. "You're so composed. You're handling this better than most." And she nodded, smiled, wore the mask. But inside, she was exhausted, tired of being admired for holding it all together when she barely recognized who she was beneath the performance. She let that version of herself go too. It started with saying, "I'm not okay," and meaning it without shame. It started with not needing to justify the days she needed space, or the hours she lay on the floor listening to songs that broke her open. She began allowing herself to be a whole person. Not just the brave one, not just the strong one. And as she softened, her world did too. Her daughter became more affectionate, less guarded. One evening, while watching a movie, the little girl leaned over and rested her head on Jennifer's shoulder. "I like our quiet house," she said, half asleep. Jennifer didn't respond. She just held her a little tighter. Outside of home, she began reconnecting with parts of herself that had long been buried. Art, nature, movement. Not in grand, curated ways, no retreats or courses, but in simple rituals. Sketching for 10 minutes before bed. Taking different walking routes through the neighborhood. Planting herbs on the balcony just to watch something grow again. One Saturday morning, at the farmer's market, she met someone. His name was Elijah. He sold handmade pottery, bowls with uneven rims, glazed in muted tones that reminded her of river stones. She complimented one. He offered a quiet smile and told her it was inspired by a piece that cracked in the kiln, but came out stronger. "It wasn't what I intended," he said, "but it became something else, still useful, still beautiful." She bought it. They didn't exchange numbers. There was no spark of romance, just a simple exchange. But as she walked away holding the bowl, she thought, "This is how life starts to return, not with fireworks, but with quiet recognitions." That evening, she placed the bowl on her windowsill. It wasn't perfect, it tilted slightly, but it held light in a way that felt honest. Later that week, she attended a community talk on mindfulness and personal renewal. The speaker wasn't flashy. An older woman named Reverend Susan, soft-voiced, deeply grounded. What she said was simple, but it landed with weight. Letting go is not passive. It's an act of faith, a willingness to trust that what is meant to remain will return, not as it was, but as it needs to be. Jennifer didn't take notes. She just closed her eyes and breathed it in. After the talk, Reverend Susan invited anyone who wanted to share to light a small candle and speak one sentence of release. Some said things like, "I let go of needing to be right," or "I release the fear of being alone." When it was Jennifer's turn, she hesitated. The room was quiet, the candle flickering in her hand. Finally, she said, "I let go of rescuing people who do not want to be saved." The flame trembled, and then steadied. She walked out into the night air with no rush. Something had settled. Not resolved, but settled. It was the difference between closing a door and locking it. She no longer needed protection. She just needed peace. That weekend, her ex called again. He said he missed the old days. Said maybe they gave up too soon? That people change. She listened, calmly, and then said something she had never said with such ease. "That chapter is closed. I'm not angry. I just know who I am now." No argument followed. Just a click. And silence. Not the hollow kind. The sacred kind. Jennifer stepped outside, barefoot on the balcony, rain still lingering in the air. The basil plant had sprouted its first real leaf. She smiled. She didn't know what came next. She didn't need to. Letting go had never been about giving up. It was, all along, about remembering that she was never the thing that needed fixing. The first time Jennifer truly felt peace, it surprised her. She was sitting on a park bench near a quiet pond, watching two ducks glide across the surface without urgency. There was no phone in her hand, no list in her mind. Just breath, wind, and stillness. And in that moment, she didn't feel strong. She felt real. For so long, she believed healing had to look like triumph, like rising from the ashes, like fierce independence, like building a new life so impressive no one could question her worth. But what she learned instead was quieter, more human. Healing wasn't about proving anything. It was about releasing the need to. She thought back to the early days, the doubts, the guilt, the endless what-ifs, the way she'd tried to turn boundaries into kindness, hoping she could protect herself without disappointing anyone. But slowly, breath by breath, she stopped explaining herself. She stopped defending her peace. She began to trust that letting go didn't mean the end of love. It meant the beginning of self-respect. She hadn't become a different person. She had simply come back to herself. The version of her that didn't live in fear, or bend in half to keep the peace, or confuse sacrifice with care. The version that allowed grief to sit beside joy, that no longer rushed through pain, that could say no without guilt and yes without fear. Her life hadn't become easier, but it had become hers. As she stood to leave the bench, The wind picked up. A few leaves skittered across the path, golden and untethered. She smiled at the small, ordinary beauty of it. Letting go didn't break her. It built her, not into something harder, but into someone softer, stronger, and finally free. And for the first time in years, she wasn't trying to move on. She was simply moving forward. Sometimes we hold on because we're afraid of who we'll be without the pain. We carry old stories, not because they serve us, but because they've become familiar. Letting go asks a different kind of courage, the kind that doesn't shout, but listens, the kind that stops asking, "What should I fix?" and starts wondering, "What can I release?" Jennifer's journey wasn't about overcoming someone else's damage. It was about no longer abandoning herself in the process. She didn't find peace by fighting harder. She found it by finally choosing to stop, by breathing instead of proving, by resting instead of running. Maybe that's the invitation for all of us. Not to win, not to rise perfectly, but to come back to ourselves, slowly and kindly, with less armor and more truth. So if you're standing at the edge of something that no longer holds you, ask this. Not, "Should I let go?" but, "What might become possible if I do?" Because letting go isn't the end, it's the return.